Welcome back. So since you're taking this course on advanced business intelligence features of Microsoft Excel, I'm assuming that you know the basics of Excel pivot tables. Things like pivot table construction and layout, grand totals and subtotals, built-in pivot table styles, slicers, and so on. If not, please refer to the optional Pivot Tables 101 section earlier in the course. Now all that is to say, in this video, we're going to discuss some pro tips for customizing the look and feel of your pivots, beyond just the fundamentals and most common use cases. Let's get started. So here in our example file, we have a pivot table that has year, month, and date on rows, product category on columns, and revenue on values. Now looking at this pivot table, you might notice that certain cells are blank. And while that's not necessarily a bad thing, for the sake of user friendliness, it's often a good idea to replace these blank values with something more descriptive. So for example, in cases where our measure simply did not have any results for a particular set of coordinates in the pivot table, let's say, for example, there were no beach supplies sold on July 14th, 2018, instead of just having a blank, we could instead show $0, reflecting that we had no revenue for beach supplies on that date, or we could return some kind of message like no items sold. So let's see how we can do that in a pivot table. So first, I'll just click anywhere inside the pivot table to select it, and then right-click and choose Pivot Table Options. And under the Layout and Format tab of the Pivot Table Options dialog box, we'll see that there is an option to enter a custom value for empty cells. So let's say we wanted to return the message, no items sold, in place of these empty cells. Let's just type that, and then click OK. And there we are. Now it's a bit clearer to an end user who may not be terribly sophisticated with Excel exactly what's going on at those coordinates in the pivot table where no items in that particular category were sold. Now again, if you don't like this particular message, or if you'd rather return a number than a message, you could just as easily return 0 as your alternate result. Now one thing to keep in mind as you're building reports to present to a potentially non-technical audience is that you should expend as much of your screen real estate, so to speak, on meaningful things that contribute to the message that your report is trying to convey, and as little screen real estate as possible on anything that does not contribute to that. So if there are components of your report that are really just taking up space and not contributing to your user's understanding of the data, it's probably in our best interest to get rid of them. So looking at our example pivot table here, we see one cell containing the phrase column labels with a filter button, and then another cell containing the phrase row labels. Now, I would argue that it's fairly self-explanatory what our row labels and column labels are doing, so unless you think a user is going to need those filter buttons and want to actively filter on the individual data points within the columns we used in our rows and columns, it's probably best to just get rid of those altogether. So to do that, we'll again right-click the pivot, choose Pivot Table Options, and now we'll click the Display tab in the Pivot Table Options dialog box. And to get rid of those unnecessary captions, we'll uncheck Display Field Captions and Filter dropdowns, and then click OK. And now as you can see, our pivot is much cleaner. Those two somewhat confusing labels are gone, and the report looks cleaner and more professional as a result. Now sometimes, as we're laying our pivot tables out, we want to customize the width of certain columns within our pivot table. Let's say, for example, for the sake of readability, we wanted to make all the columns in our pivot table just a little bit wider. So I can highlight all of these and then just resize one of them, and then all of them will be resized to that width. But what happens if I refresh the data source of the pivot table now? So we'll go to our Data tab, and then refresh. And we see that by default, the width of our columns automatically adjusted to just barely accommodate the data within those columns. Now, sometimes this is helpful behavior, and if you've used Excel for any length of time, you've probably used the autofit feature to fit column widths to their data. But again, we're building a report for consumption by a wide audience. We may want to customize the look and feel of our pivot tables to a very specific level and not want our design decisions to be overridden by this default. So if we want those column widths to remain at the exact levels that we set them, we'll again have to go into our pivot table options to configure those defaults. So we'll right-click, pivot table options, and now what we'll do is uncheck auto fit column widths on update, and then click OK. And now we'll widen out our columns again, and then refresh. And as you can see, after the refresh is completed, our column widths remain the same. Now, one thing I'll point out is that while our column names here are similar in length, beach supplies, riding supplies, and surfing products all have roughly the same number of characters. This option becomes especially important if you have columns whose names are of significantly different length, because now the autofit will cause one column to be very narrow and another column to be very wide, which very often isn't the kind of professional look and feel that you want for a report that you're potentially submitting to a wide audience. Now, if you're familiar with pivot table layouts, you probably recognize that by default, this pivot table is using the compact layout. And that basically means that all the fields we use as row labels are collapsed into a single column. So you know that we have year, month, and date all on rows, but these fields are all contained within column B. The values in each field are simply positioned under the values in the field that's the next level up in the hierarchy. Now, most of the time, this compact layout is the most readable and user-friendly. But sometimes, we need the fields that we have on rows to each have their own columns, and we need the values in those fields to be repeated for every row and every subgroup, essentially mirroring how the data would be organized in an Excel table or a database. Now, later on, we'll encounter a specific scenario where this is the case. So to do this, we'll first convert our pivot table to a tabular layout. So I'll go to my Design tab, and then Report Layout, and then Show in Tabular Form. And as you can see, each of the fields we have on rows now gets its own column. That's basically what tabular view is all about. Now, the next step is to go back to Report Layout and select Repeat All Item Labels. And now the data in our pivot is more or less organized like a standard table. And I can even get the column headers for these individual columns back if I go back into my options, and then the Display tab, and then recheck that Display Field Captions and Filter dropdowns field. So now we have a pivot table that is still very much functionally a pivot table, but also has the layout of a standard Excel table or even a table in a database. And again, as we'll see later, sometimes this layout can be exactly what we need for certain specific purposes. All right. Up next, we're going to look at another method for customizing the appearance of our pivot tables, one which majorly enhances our ability to tell a story with our data: conditional formatting. I'll see you then.